In a secluded corner of the mountains, where the wind whispers gently and the leaves fall as if time itself slid by without haste, an elderly monk lived. His name was Ryoku, and his life had been marked by the search for truth beyond words. One day, a young traveler arrived at the monastery in search of wisdom. He had traveled great distances, crossed rushing rivers, and climbed steep hills, all to find answers to his concerns. Upon arrival, he approached the monk, hoping that he would provide the answers he so longed for. The elderly monk, sitting in meditation beneath a tree, did not move even upon noticing the presence of the young man. The traveler, puzzled, bowed before him and asked with a trembling voice, "Master, I have traveled far seeking wisdom. What can I do to find inner peace?" Ryoku remained silent. The wind continued its dance through the tree branches, and the shadows slowly lengthened, as if time itself was also waiting for a response. Finally, the monk opened his eyes, looked at the young man, and without speaking a word, pointed to the landscape before them. The mountains, the clear sky, the river flowing in the distance. Everything was calm. Silence enveloped everything. "Do you hear it?" the monk finally said, pointing his finger towards the horizon. "Silence is everywhere. Can you hear it?" The young man observed attentively. For a moment, he thought there was nothing to hear. But then, something changed. The breeze caressing his face, the faint sound of the leaves moving, and the soft current of the river seemed to form a melody that could only be perceived in silence. Silence, young traveler, is not emptiness or absence, but the full presence of what is. It is the space where everything is revealed, where the heart meets itself. The young man nodded slowly, but his mind was still filled with questions. "But how can I live in silence if my mind is always full of thoughts?" Ryoku closed his eyes again, as if reflecting on the question, and then said, "Silence is not outside of you. It is within, waiting to be heard. If you wish to find it, do not search in the noise. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and allow your thoughts to dissipate like clouds in the sky. Only then will silence speak." The young man, though still confused, decided to follow the monk's instructions. He sat near him, closed his eyes, and began to breathe deeply. At first, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The concerns of his journey, doubts about his life, questions that he had yet to resolve. Each breath seemed to carry more noise, more thoughts. Ryoku observed in silence, with a calm that seemed to arise from something much deeper than time or space. The hours passed slowly, but the young man did not move, determined to listen to the silence the monk had shown him. Suddenly, something changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the young man felt as if his mind began to clear, as if the clouds of his thoughts were slowly dissipating. The calm he had observed in the landscape now slid inside him, enveloping him. A soft murmur arose within him, not like a voice, but as a deep vibration, a sense of being in complete harmony with his surroundings. There were no words, only being in its purest form. The young man opened his eyes, not to see the outer world, but to look inside himself. "Have you found it?" Ryoku asked, without moving, without hurry. The young man nodded, but said nothing. Words no longer seemed necessary. In that moment, he understood that silence was not something he had to search for outside of himself, but something that had always been present within his own being, waiting to be discovered. Silence is not something imposed, nor something that can be reached through effort, the monk continued. It is a natural state, like the clear water of a river that flows without haste, but without rest. Only when you stop fighting against it can it fill you. The young man, still immersed in the stillness of the moment, felt a deep peace. The agitation of his mind, which had chased him for so many years, seemed to have been left behind, vanished in the silence that now surrounded him. But peace was not a destination. It was only a step. The monk had spoken of harmony with the flow of the river, and somehow the young man felt that this was his next lesson. The stillness of the moment had arrived, but the journey had not ended. "What should I do now, master?" the young man finally asked, with a calm he had never felt before. Ryoka smiled, but his answer was simple, as it always was. "Listen more deeply. Silence is still waiting, and it always has something new to teach you." The young man, now immersed in stillness, continued to meditate on the monk's words. Despite the peace he felt, there was something more that seemed to whisper in the depths of his being, something he still did not fully understand. He decided to spend the following days at the monastery, not only seeking to listen to silence but also to understand what it meant to live in it. Monk Ryoku did not offer him more words, only those necessary to guide his practice. Every morning, the young man meditated with him at dawn, and every afternoon, he walked around the monastery grounds, always in silence. One of those days, while walking near a small stream, the young man stopped to observe how the water flowed between the stones, sliding effortlessly, touching each corner with a softness that seemed endless. He realized something. The water did not fight against the stones. It simply surrounded them, adapted, flowed over them without resistance. The young man felt a wave of understanding. He had been seeking complicated answers, but life was not complicated. The river did not need to fight to find its path. It simply flowed. Like silence, he thought. It did not need to impose itself. It just had to be. At that moment, Ryoku appeared by his side, as if he had been watching in silence from afar. "The river never stops, even though sometimes the stones try to obstruct its course," said the monk, as if reading the young man's thoughts. "Silence, like water, does not stop. It may be obstructed, but it never disappears. It just needs to find a way." The young man looked at the monk, and for the first time, he understood that silence was not an absence, but a constant presence. It was not about eliminating the noise of the world or of his thoughts, but allowing the natural flow of life to make its way, without obstacles, without resistance. "But master, what happens when the noise becomes too loud? When the mind is filled with thoughts we cannot control?" Ryoku looked at him with a profound serenity. "The noise is not the enemy. The enemy is the desire to avoid it. If you fight against the noise, you make it stronger. If you accept it as part of the flow of life, it dissolves by itself. Silence is not the absence of noise, but the ability to find peace within it." The young man reflected on these words while the sound of the stream surrounded him. He could not avoid the thoughts that came to his mind, but he could choose how to respond to them. Like the water, he could surround them without letting them control him. Peace is not found in the absence of thoughts, but in the acceptance of them without attachment, continued Ryoku. When you let thoughts come and go like the waves of the sea, without holding on to them, you find the peace of silence within them. The days in the monastery passed slowly, and the young man found himself more and more immersed in the practice of silence. However, although he was starting to understand it in his mind, something still troubled him. Why, if silence is so natural, did it sometimes seem so difficult to attain? What was blocking him? One morning, while meditating under a tree, the young man felt a slight discomfort in his chest. It was as if something was about to emerge, something hidden that he still didn't understand. He looked at the monk Ryoku, who was meditating nearby, and saw that his face was a mask of peace, undisturbed, like the calm water of a deep lake. The young man, unable to keep the silence of his mind, slowly approached the monk. "Master, I have been seeking silence, but sometimes it feels harder than I thought. What prevents me from attaining it? Ryoku opened his eyes and looked at the young man with a calmness that seemed to infuse even more serenity. What do you feel in your chest? The monk asked softly. The young man touched his chest and replied, I feel a pressure, something that prevents me from breathing freely, as if I am trapped in something I cannot let go of. Ryoku nodded slowly, understanding. He stood up and walked toward the young man. The answer lies in what you are unwilling to let go of. Sometimes the noise of the mind is the noise of our desires, our attachments. As long as you hold onto what belongs to you, silence cannot find space within you. The young man looked at the monk, confused. Are you referring to thoughts or something deeper? Ryoku smiled, a gesture full of understanding. Everything around you, young traveler, has a purpose, but the purpose is not to possess. The noise of the mind, the one you cannot silence, is the noise of desire, of wanting. When you desire something too strongly, silence fills with those shadows. But when you let go of those desires, the space empties, and silence becomes more present. The young man remained silent for a long while, letting the monk's words penetrate his consciousness. Was it desire that kept him trapped in the constant noise of his mind? He recalled all the moments when his mind had been full of thoughts wanting something more. More wisdom, more peace, more answers. Each of those desires seemed like another stone on the path to silence. Ryoku gave him a light pat on the shoulder, as if reading his thoughts. Silence is not a search for something. It is a return to what has always been here, within you. Let go of the desires that cloud your mind, and you will find what already is. Silence is not found in what you seek, but in what you release. The young man nodded slowly, a sense of understanding beginning to blossom within him. He didn't need to search anymore. He just needed to let go. The young man felt a light breeze that moved the leaves of the trees, as if nature itself were whispering a silent confirmation to the monk's words. He stayed there for a moment, eyes closed, listening to the natural flow of the world around him. He was no longer searching for something outside himself. The peace he sought seemed to be here, in the stillness of the moment, in the space between his thoughts. Several more days passed, and with each new practice, the young man delved deeper into silence. During the meditations, he was surprised to discover that his mind, once so full of chaos and noise, was beginning to find spaces of calm, though occasionally a spark of desire still tried to interrupt his peace. But now he understood that those desires were nothing more than passing clouds, which could dissipate as easily as they arrived. One afternoon, while walking along the path near the monastery, Ryoku reached him again. The young man wasn't sure what had brought him there, but upon seeing him, something inside him began to awaken. The monk had a deep look, as if he were observing something beyond the visible. "You've been practicing well, young traveler," said Ryoku with a serene smile. "But there is something more you need to understand." The young man, now confident in his experience of silence, nodded. "What else must I learn, master?" Ryoku looked at him intently, as if wanting to see beyond his words, beyond what the young man had reached so far. Silence is not just absence. It is also presence. It is not a void, but a filling. Silence is full of everything that is. It is not only stillness, but the heartbeat of life itself. The monk paused, and then continued, with a softness that touched the soul. "In your search for silence, you've begun to empty yourself, but you must also learn to fill yourself with it." The young man reflected on these words. It wasn't just about learning to empty his mind of thoughts and desires, but learning to allow silence to fill his being in a deep and complete way. "How does one fill oneself with silence, master?" he asked. with a mix of curiosity and humility. Ryoku pointed to the sky. The sun was beginning to set, painting the clouds in orange and pink, and the air was filled with a palpable serenity. Silence is filled with what is present. Do you see the sunset? The sky does not seek anything, but it is beautiful. The river does not long for anything, but it always flows. Life itself is full of silence, but only those who can see without holding on to anything experience it fully. The young man looked at the horizon, and for a moment, everything he had learned came to life. It was not just about distancing himself from noise or external distractions. It was about harmonizing with what was already happening, with what was, without trying to control it or change it. Ryoku continued, "Silence doesn't have to be sought. It is only found when you stop trying to control it. When you accept each moment as it is, silence reveals itself in its entirety. The flow of the world, the whisper of the wind, the song of the birds, all of this is silence in motion. Do not fight against the flow of life. Learn to move with it." The days passed slowly, and the young man began to understand the truth behind the monk's words. Silence was no longer just a refuge to escape from thoughts. Now, it became a state of being in which everything happening around him integrated without resistance. He could see the harmony in the small details of life, the way the shadows stretched at sunset, the gentle hum of bees in the gardens, and how each fallen leaf found its place on the ground, without struggling to remain on the tree. Each morning, he would wake up early, before the sun touched the horizon, to meditate alongside the monk. The hours of silence became a constant exercise of presence, and the young man stopped seeing silence as something passive. He learned that silence was not only the stillness of the body and mind, but also an active attention to the present, a willingness to receive the moment as it is. One afternoon, while meditating by the river, the young man watched how the waters moved in a constant flow, with no stone or obstacle able to stop its course. However, as his eyes followed the movement of the water, something curious happened. He saw how a small twig was gently carried by the current. At first, it seemed insignificant, but as he followed it, he realized that the twig, unknowingly, was being dragged by the water into a small whirlpool. The current was so strong at that point that the twig spun in circles, unable to escape. The young man felt a strange empathy for the small twig. He thought about how, sometimes, his own desires and worries dragged him, like that twig, into a whirlpool of thoughts that he couldn't control. How could he find silence if he felt trapped by his own thoughts, like that twig caught in the current? At that moment, Ryoku appeared beside him, as if he had been silently observing from a nearby corner. "What do you see?" the monk asked, pointing to the river. The young man, aware of the implicit teaching, responded, "I see how the twig follows the course of the water, unable to escape the current, as if it were trapped in something it cannot control." Ryoku smiled softly. "And do you feel like that twig?" The young man nodded, his gaze fixed on the water. "Sometimes I feel like my thoughts drag me, and I can't stop them. I feel trapped, like the twig." The monk looked toward the river with serenity and said, "The twig has no control over the water, but it doesn't need to control it either. The water does not drag it forcefully. The twig simply allows itself to be carried, trusting in the natural flow. If the twig struggled against the current, it would be dragged more quickly, but if it surrenders to the river, it flows effortlessly." The young man reflected deeply on these words. Wasn't he doing the same thing with his thoughts? Fighting them, rejecting them, trying to control them, and the more he tried to control them, the more power they had over him. Silence, young traveler, is like the river. You are the twig. If you fight against the flow of your thoughts, they will drag you. But if you learn to flow with them, without attachment, without resistance, Silence will come naturally, like the river following its course. The young man closed his eyes, and for a moment, he allowed himself to flow with the current of his mind, without trying to stop it, without judging it. Like the twig, he let his thoughts come and go without clinging to them. In that instant, he experienced something deeply liberating. The noise of his mind was no longer a burden, but a flow that he could accept, like the waves fading on the shore. Peace was not the absence of thoughts, but the acceptance of their presence, flowing with them without attachment. The young man walked back to the monastery with a new feeling, as if he had released a weight he didn't even know he was carrying. Ryoku's teachings, though simple, were beginning to resonate within him with a clarity that felt deep and true. Silence was no longer something he had to seek outside of himself. It wasn't about avoiding or repressing thoughts, but about ceasing to identify with them, allowing them to flow without clinging to them. That night, when he settled into his small room, the full moon illuminated the sky. He decided to sit and meditate once more, this time with a different attitude. He no longer sat with the expectation of achieving some goal or reaching a state of peace. He simply sat as he was, with an open mind, with no desire in his heart. There was no self to let go of, no goal to reach. There was only being. The hours passed, and the young man realized that, for the first time, his mind was quiet without effort. It wasn't the stillness of an empty mind, but the peace of a mind that accepted what was, without resistance. Thoughts came and went, but he no longer followed them or identified with them. They were just waves in the vast ocean of being. At that moment, a soft laugh broke the silence. The young man opened his eyes and saw monk Ryoku, who had entered the room without making a sound. "Why are you laughing, master?" the young man asked, surprised. Ryoku looked at him with a gaze full of understanding and tenderness. "Because, young traveler, you have just discovered something that many spend a lifetime searching for. That silence is not a state to be achieved, but a state that has always been there. You just needed to remember how to return to it." The young man smiled, feeling deep gratitude. There was no longer any need to seek answers outside of himself. Silence was already present. It was just that his mind had needed to learn how to see beyond the confusion of thoughts. "But, master," the young man continued, "how can I maintain this silence in my daily life, between activities, amidst the noise of the world?" Ryoku looked at him deeply, as if evaluating each word. The outside world will always be full of noise, but silence does not depend on the outside world. It depends on how you respond to it. The true challenge is not finding a place without noise, but being able to find silence within yourself, even amid the noise. If you can be present in each moment, without attachment to the outcomes, silence will remain. The key is not to escape the world, but to learn to be in it without losing yourself. The young man nodded, understanding that the true path to peace was not to escape, but to integrate silence into every action, every thought, every breath. "So, should I act in the world but from silence?" he asked with new clarity. "Exactly," Ryoku replied. "True silence is not an escape. It is a return to the center. If you act from the center of your being, in harmony with the flow of life, then every action, no matter how simple, will be imbued with that silence. It is not the silence of isolation, but the silence of being present, whole in the moment." The young man stood up, feeling a deep peace, as if everything in the universe had finally fallen into place. There were no more questions, only a space that was both empty and full at the same time, a space where answers arose effortlessly. The next day, the young man woke up with a sense of lightness he had never experienced before. As he carried out the daily tasks of the monastery, he realized that his mind no longer jumped from one thought to another as often. Instead, Each action seemed to be a meditation in itself, an act performed with full awareness and presence. As he cleaned the garden, he didn't just move his hands to arrange the plants. He felt each leaf he touched, each branch that slid between his fingers, as if each of those gestures were an extension of his being. When sweeping the floor, each sweep was a complete act, and the sound of the sweeping was not a distraction, but a melody that matched the calm beat of his heart. The monk Ryoku observed him in silence, knowing that the young man had taken another step toward true understanding. He approached him during a moment of rest. "I see you've begun to understand what it means to be in the world without losing the center," Ryoku said with a subtle smile. The young man nodded, though he couldn't find the words to express everything he felt. "Everything is clearer now, master," he replied. "Every action, every moment seems to be full of meaning. I no longer seek silence. I simply find it in everything I do." Ryoku looked at him with a deep expression, as if he were seeing something far beyond the visible. Silence is not something found in the future, nor in the past. Silence is in the present. When you are completely present, without distractions or desires, you find silence in the depth of each moment. It is the heartbeat of life itself, and it is not separate from you, nor from what you do. The young man understood. Silence was not a refuge. It was not a place he escaped to in order to find peace. It was the quality with which he experienced the world. Being present in what he did, in what he thought, in what he felt, without attachment or judgment, allowed him to find the silence of the mind in any circumstance. The following afternoon, the young man accompanied Ryoku to a small viewpoint near the monastery, where they could see the vast expanse of the mountain that surrounded the place. The air was fresh, and the sun was beginning to set, bathing everything in a golden light. "This is a good place to observe, to be in silence," Ryoku said, pointing to the landscape. The young man looked at the horizon, feeling that something deep was beginning to happen within him. As he observed the simple beauty of nature, he realized that, in that moment, there was no difference between him and the landscape. The same air that surrounded him, the mountains, the trees, everything seemed to be part of a single flow of life, and he was a small but essential part of it. "I am not separate from what I see," he said softly, as if he had just discovered a universal truth. Ryoku nodded in silence, satisfied with the understanding that had emerged. Silence is not only within you, young traveler. It is in everything around you. The entire universe vibrates with it. When you connect with the present, when you stop trying to divide the world into I and the other, you find that everything is imbued with that same essence. Silence is not a refuge, nor a technique. It is the very nature of existence. The young man remained silent, allowing those words to settle in his heart. The monk did not offer more explanations, for he knew that the young man had already taken another step in his understanding. Now, the young man no longer needed to search. He had learned that silence is both the teacher and the disciple. It is not sought, only experienced. The sun set completely, and the darkness of the night began to envelop the landscape. However, the young man did not feel darkness within himself. In his heart, there was a soft light, a deep peace that could never be extinguished. The days continued to flow without hurry, and the young man began to notice a subtle but deep transformation in his daily life. Every time his hands touched a tool, every time his body moved, every time his eyes met another's, he felt the silence present. It was as if everything he did were an extension of the stillness he had found within himself. The difference now was that it was no longer just an inner state, but a way of being in the world. One afternoon, as he walked through the monastery, he crossed paths with a visitor who had arrived at the temple. It was an elderly man with a deep gaze, who did not seem to be in a hurry in the slightest. Upon seeing him, the young man remembered the first lessons he had received from Ryoku and decided to approach this visitor, feeling that something important could arise from this encounter. "Good afternoon," the young man said, bowing slightly in respect. The elderly man looked at him with a calm expression and smiled slightly. "Good afternoon, young one. Are you looking for something in particular?" The young man remained silent for a moment, feeling that the question was deeper than it seemed. He remembered how he had arrived at the monastery, searching for answers, seeking peace. But now, after so much time in silence, he understood that he no longer sought anything. "No, I am not looking for anything," he finally replied. "I am just here, in this moment, with no need to find anything." The elderly man nodded with a serene smile. "Then you have found what all are searching for, even if they do not know it. The secret is not in finding, but in being. Being in the present moment without desire, without fear, just being." The young man looked at the elderly man, feeling that his words resonated with what he had already experienced. It was not about pursuing a goal, about obtaining something more. Silence, peace were already present. He only had to allow them to be. Silence is not separate from you. It is what you are when you stop fighting, wanting, searching, continued the elderly man, as if reading the young man's mind. It is what remains when everything else disappears. The young man felt a surge of gratitude and understanding. He no longer needed words or explanations. Everything he had been searching for, he had found in the silence. The moment was complete as it was, with no need to add anything more. Suddenly, the elderly man began to walk slowly, and the young man followed him without thinking. There were no words between them, only the soft sound of their steps on the ground and the shared presence of the moment. Finally, they arrived at a small clearing, where a stream of clear water flowed peacefully. The elderly man stopped and looked at the water with a serenity that seemed to reflect in the calmness of the waters. "Water always flows," said the elderly man, pointing to the current. "This is silence. You don't trap it, you don't control it. You allow it to flow like water, and you find it in every moment. Only when you stop interrupting the flow does silence reveal itself in its entirety." The young man looked at the water, feeling the deep truth of those words. Silence was not something that could be retained or possessed. It was a natural flow, one that could only be experienced when you let go, when you flowed with it. There was no need to force it, only to allow it. In that moment, the young man understood that there was no beyond to seek. Silence was not a destination, but a way of living. It was in the moment, in the now, in every breath, in every step. At dawn the next day, the young man woke up without the anxiety he once had, without the need to search for something else. There was no longer a mind wondering what would come next, nor a heart desiring to reach a distant goal. Silence, like a gentle shadow, had become his constant companion. That morning, as he carried out the daily tasks of the monastery, he realized something essential. Silence was not something that could be defined with words. It was a direct experience, a palpable sensation that needed no explanation. As he swept the courtyard, he listened to the soft brushing of the bristles against the ground. Each sound joined the rhythm of his breath, and the simplicity of the task became a tranquil dance. Ryoku, observing from a distance, saw the complete transformation in the young man. He was no longer the same person who had arrived at the monastery with a restless mind, seeking answers. Now he walked in silence, not as someone running from the noises of the world, but as someone who had learned to be present with everything around him, without separating from the flow of life. At the end of the day, while in the garden, Ryoku approached the young man one last time. "You have learned to be in silence, not because you seek it, but because you are already a part of it," said Ryoku, his voice soft but full of wisdom. The young man nodded, with a deep calm emanating from his being. "There is nothing more to search for," he replied, almost without realizing. "Silence is here, it has always been here." The monk smiled with satisfaction, as if he knew the young man had reached true understanding. There were no more teachings to offer, only the invitation to live from that silence. "The journey has no end," said Ryoku. "Silence is always available, but it is the being that must learn to return to it, again and again. It is not an achievement, but a way of living. In every moment, in every action, in every breath, there is silence. You only need to remember." The young man, with a light heart full of gratitude, looked at the horizon once more. There was no need for words, nor promises. The cycle of his learning had come to an end, but in truth it was only beginning. Silence had integrated into his being, and there was no longer any difference between him and the world around him. Every moment was now an opportunity to live from silence, to be the silence in the flow of life. And so the young man continued his path, not as a seeker, but as a conscious witness of the present, knowing that silence is not something that can be found or lost, but something that simply is.